Good morning, and thank you for joining UCI Mind today for a live discussion and Q&A on how heart health impacts the brain. I'm Chelsea Cox, Associate Director of Education at UCI Mind, which is an NIH-designated Alzheimer's disease research center at the University of California, Irvine. UCI Mind has over 100 researchers who are working together to solve Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, and we collaborate with our colleagues across the country at other Alzheimer's disease research centers. This episode today is part of a monthly Q&A series where live viewers have the opportunity to ask questions of our nation's leading experts. And today, joining me on the topic of the link between heart health and brain health is Dr. Daniel Nation. So I'm going to go ahead and bring him on the screen here. Hi, Dr. Nation. How are you?
Hi, I'm great. How are you? Thanks for having me on.
Good. Thanks for joining me today to discuss this important topic, the link between brain health and heart health. Before we get started, I'll take a few moments to introduce Dr. Nation to all of you. Dr. Nation is an associate professor of psychological science in the UCI School of Social Ecology. He earned his PhD in clinical health psychology from the University of Miami, and he completed residency in neuropsychology and a postdoctoral fellowship training in biological psychiatry and neuroscience at UC San Diego. Dr. Nation's research examines the role of vascular factors in cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease with an aim to improve early detection and identify targets for potential new therapies. So hopefully we'll get to talk about some of those ideas, those new targets and potential new therapies today. So thank you. I see several of you are joining us live right now. If this is your first time joining UCI Mind for this live Q&A series, here's how it works. I'll get started by asking Dr. Nation a few questions on the topic of brain health and heart health. And then as you have questions that come up in the conversation, you can go ahead and type them there in the comments box that accompanies this video, and Dr. Nation will address as many questions as he has time for. Please do note that we are on Facebook, so whatever you post will be linked to your name and visible to others, so please do post responsibly. Okay, Dr. Nation, let's focus now on some of your work. So thanks again for joining me. Today we're discussing the link between heart health and brain health with all of our attendees. And first, I wanted to ask, how are our hearts and our brains connected, and how do they interact?
That's a great question, Chelsea. They're actually quite intimately connected. The brain requires tons of blood flow, torrential blood flow, much more than you would expect for its size, much more than most other organs in the body. And so the supply of blood coming from the heart and the blood vessels is very important for brain function. It's thought that the brain has up to 400 miles of these little tiny microvessels that provide nutrients to the brain cells, the neurons, to keep them functioning normally. And so this means that it's very important that the vessels stay healthy in order for the brain to stay healthy. And it's thought that there's so many vessels that each cell in the brain, each neuron in the brain has its own blood vessel dedicated to it. And so that's why this is an important area of study in cognitive impairment and dementia.
400 miles, you said, of vessels. Wow.
Yes.
We hear a lot when we talk about the link between heart health and brain health about something called the blood-brain barrier. So what exactly is the blood-brain barrier, and why is it important in Alzheimer's research?
Yeah, it's something that a lot of people may not have heard of before, but the brain is actually a special organ that has to keep a special environment, special biology, in order for the brain cells to work, to communicate with each other through the electrical signals that they use. And so in order for that to occur and work properly, it has to be sealed off from the blood, which is a different type of environment. And so those a bunch of cells kind of form this organ that enwraps and protects the brain from the blood supply and keeps those things quarantined. If that barrier breaks or opens, then the vessels begin to leak into the brain, and that's toxic and actually kills brain tissue. And so it's thought that if that happens, this could trigger the degeneration of the brain, similar to what we see in Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia.
And is that something that is thought to happen in Alzheimer's disease and other dementias?
Yes, only very recently we have discovered in a series of major studies that, in fact, the memory centers in the brain in older adults with cognitive impairment, memory impairment and so forth, those areas actually show leakiness in the vessels. And this seems to be different than the sticky amyloid proteins that build up in the brains as a part of Alzheimer's disease. It's a separate process that independently is contributing to memory decline in folks. And we've also found that people at genetic risk of Alzheimer's disease, those vessels are leaking very early, even when they have no symptoms. And so it's thought to be a very early process that could be a major contributor to mental decline and ultimately dementia.
Okay. Now, in your lab at UCI Mine, you and your team focus on cardiovascular contributions to Alzheimer's disease. So could you tell us what are some of the things that you've learned so far?
Yes. So we've known actually for quite a while that if people have cardiovascular risk factors like high blood pressure or high cholesterol or diabetes or heart disease, that they're at increased risk for cognitive impairment, and that this is linked to Alzheimer's dementia in a lot of big studies that have been done clinically. And so from there, we've begun to try and study, well, how exactly is this happening? Are these factors actually directly influencing the disease process in Alzheimer's, or is this an independent process? And what we've really focused in on, again, are these microvessels and the blood-brain barrier and the functioning of these little vessels, that if they have to stay healthy to help clear waste products from the brain, to help provide nutrients to the neurons, and to generally provide blood flow and support to the brain. And if they're not healthy due to risk factors, then you end up with brain dysfunction and neurodegeneration.
I'm sorry, I forgot to bring myself on the screen and no one could hear me while I was asking my question.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so what I was asking off screen, so what are some of the what are some of the projects then that you're currently working on to improve this understanding in your lab with your team?
Yeah, we really have two projects that we're very excited about that we think are really going to have a big impact. The first one is to better study these small vessels in the brain, because they're hard to study and we only just now have the technology. And so we're trying to see if we can detect these early changes, such as leaking of the vessels or not providing adequate blood flow or other dysfunction. And this will help us to find out if someone's at risk of these blood vessel problems leading to cognitive impairment at a very early stage. We're trying to study this in people who don't yet have cognitive impairment so that we can intervene early potentially to benefit the vessels. And so that's the hope, is to identify new biological markers in the vessels that we can then tailor treatments to. And then the second area I'm very interested in is the idea that we have these stem cells actually in our blood that support vessel health already, just naturally. And so I'm studying those, again, in older adults who are sort of at risk for memory problems, to try and see whether those are actually supporting and protecting the vessels and preventing people from developing cognitive problems, again, with the eye towards finding people maybe who are at risk, who have a deficiency in those cells, and possibly leading to treatments that could target those and to again, help protect the vessels in older adults.
Okay, and you mentioned, you weren't previously able to study these types of things because of the technology that was needed. What types of technologies are you using that are making this possible now?
Yeah, we focus predominantly on brain MRI.
Okay.
And so we can do brain MRI with advanced techniques. We can actually measure blood flow through these smaller vessels. And that's actually a pretty recent development. And so all we know about the brain vessels has been mostly focused on these larger vessels. And we've learned a lot in that. But as it turns out with dementia, particularly Alzheimer's disease, it's really the micro vessels, the microscopic vessels that are most interesting and maybe most implicated. And so we're leveraging these new advances and new techniques with MRI to try and study those.
You mentioned, focusing on earlier identification and detection. So are these scans that you're looking at, are they mostly in people before they have cognitive symptoms, or?
We study people who are either, completely normal on our cognitive exams, or who perhaps have some very mild cognitive deficits. So yeah, we're still focused on early stage events, and partly because in our research thus far, we found that the vascular changes occur very early.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's been a big focus, is trying to place them in the cascade of events that leads to dementia, and it seems to be an early event.
Yeah, so that you can hopefully target those vascular issues early for potential treatment targets. We have a question here, kind of on that topic. So, is there a way that we can, as lay people, slow or stop the leaking into the blood-brain barrier, such as nutrition or things like that? So, what are some potential interventions that might be available to people?
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing about the cardiovascular contribution is that we do have lots of knowledge about cardiovascular health. People who have risk factors will have doctors following those risk factors and treating them for those risk factors. And so it's just important to know and understand that anything that's going to be healthy for your heart and your blood vessels is also very likely to help protect your brain from these problems that we see in the smaller vessels that really drive a lot of the memory decline and dementia in older adults. So I would say get checked to be sure you have these risk factors or don't have them. If you do have them, be sure that you get them treated and you follow your doctor's instructions. So things that are good for your heart health, diet and exercise, things like that, whatever your doctor's instructions are to manage your individual case, it's important to follow those because it can affect your mental health as well.
Okay, so those are some examples of lifestyle interventions that we can all incorporate into our lives right now to try to maintain a healthy heart and thus a healthy brain. Does your research point to any other potential interventions for Alzheimer's disease, such as therapeutics or new treatments?
Yes, there's possibilities and ideas. There are drugs out there that have been used to benefit some of the pathways that we've discovered leading to blood vessel leakage, but we're still at an early stage of the research. So we're not in a position to really make clinical recommendations or anything like that. But our findings have triggered people to consider new clinical trials for some medications that do exist. And so that's very good news because it would mean that those drugs could become available to patients much more quickly as opposed to starting from scratch and trying to make a new drug or something like that. So I think there's hope that there will be clinical implications down the road.
Yeah, it's good to learn that you're working toward different types. We have researchers at UCMI working toward different types of targets for this disease because there are so many factors and components that play a part in Alzheimer's and dementia. We have another question here from a viewer. Are your studies that you do, Dr. Nation, exclusive to dementia caused by Alzheimer's, or are they open to other forms of dementia?
It's really broader. My predominant interest, just as Chelsea mentioned, there are many different things that influence mental health, cognitive function, memory function, and all of that accumulates to lead to dementia. And so Alzheimer's disease is one disease. It's the most important perhaps, but it's not the only thing. And so really I'm mostly focused on the cognitive disorder itself and what's contributing. And what we found is the leaky vessels, for example, but also I would say when there's low blood flow through these small vessels, we see that actually predicts cognitive dysfunction in people who have Alzheimer's disease, have the markers of Alzheimer's disease, and in people who don't. And that was one of the biggest discoveries we made, is that this seems to be kind of an independent thing that is a big contributor in Alzheimer's, but also just in general in people who don't yet perhaps have Alzheimer's disease in their brains.
Yeah, just on this note regarding clinical trials and research studies that are happening at UC Irvine, there are always different types of studies that are going on, not just in Alzheimer's disease, but other forms of dementia and other areas of health research. So if you want to stay informed of those types of studies, you can visit UCI's Consent to Contact Registry, and the website for that is on the screen right here, c2c.uci.edu. And this is a website where you could be notified about different studies on different health topics that you might be eligible for. I see another study here from our viewer. Are the studies done at UCI Mine shared between departments? So do you collaborate with other departments or other colleagues?
Yes, absolutely. I'm a big fan of collaboration, and I've always done that at prior institutions, and I'm still relatively new to UC Irvine, so I'm just getting started, but we've reached out. We're starting collaborations with a bunch of other large studies across all sorts of departments. And that's really one of the strengths of UC Irvine, is this UCI Mind Institute brings us all together. We have neuroscientists, neuropsychologists, pathologists, all from different departments working together on the same problem, and which is really necessary because it's quite complex.
Yeah, there's a lot of interdisciplinary collaboration happening here at UCI. And Dr. Nation, we were fortunate that he recently joined us from USC, University of Southern California. So are you still maintaining collaborations across universities too, and across the country at other Alzheimer's disease research centers?
Yes, and I actually was at UC San Diego prior to that, and I still have collaborations at all those places, and we have funded research that spans multiple institutions, not just in California, but across the country and overseas. So we have a web of collaborative projects that are ongoing at any given time.
Yeah, that's so important to connect with other people in the field and share resources and ideas. Another question here, Dr. Nation, can you see visually the leaking on a regular brain MRI? So I assume the leaking of the blood-brain barrier.
No, you can't, and that's part of the reason this wasn't discovered until very recently. It sort of has always been there, but we didn't know. And the ways to assess the blood-brain barrier leakage have really, again, that's another technology that has advanced to be able to really get sensitively assess that. And so you can see it on brain MRIs, but it has to be a special kind of MRI where we inject contrast and we do certain scans, and then we have to do some math. And so it's not a regular brain MRI, won't show you the leakage.
Okay. And there's another question here that's a bit specific to participation in a particular clinical trial, and then the development of AFib. So I'm not sure that, Dr. Nation, feel free to speak up, but I'm not sure that we could speak to that specifically, and it'd be really important to speak with the clinical trial team about your concerns to see if there could be any sort of connection. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't want to comment on that in a specific, medical situation like that.
Okay. So, Dr. Nation, then, moving forward, what do you think are the most important next steps for addressing the role of vascular contributions to Alzheimer's dementia?
Yeah, so I think that we need to identify, again, these very early biological markers of important blood vessel dysfunction that can be treated, can be targeted. And so that's really what we're working on right now. And I think our blood-brain barrier work has already kind of headed in that direction and has already got some potential interventional agents that could be used in trials. So that has been very productive. But we have additional studies and additional markers that we're pursuing in the same respect. So the idea is identify very early stage when people have no symptoms, that they have these abnormalities in the vessels, and then tailor treatments to fix those. And then that just funnels into more trials. And we have a totally different approach than what is currently been done in most of the trials. And I think that will be exciting and hopefully will lead to some positive results.
Now, I attended your presentation yesterday on cognitive testing, serial cognitive testing, in mild cognitive impairment and in early Alzheimer's disease for early identification. So you're talking a lot about early identification in terms of vascular factors, but could you speak a little bit also about your work that you're doing around cognitive testing and early identification?
Sure. Yeah. One big challenge to the field of dementia is that, as many of you may recognize, the progression to ultimately have dementia is very long and very slow, and it's slow and it's gradual and it's insidious, and you don't necessarily fully recognize it until perhaps there's quite a bit of brain damage and quite a bit of behavioral problems and memory loss, because people compensate and they fluctuate in their function, and it's hard to distinguish from expected changes in memory with aging. And so that's what we do with our neuropsychological testing. We try to identify what's normal and what's abnormal in terms of your memory function, for example. And so we've worked on ways to try and do a better job of this, to improve our ability to distinguish normal memory decline from abnormal or concerning memory decline. And I think this is important because currently with the clinical trials, we don't always have the most sophisticated approaches because of the many challenges, again, with this long, slow, insidious process. And so the hope is to improve our ability to distinguish normal and abnormal memory change, and so those issues can be addressed, and at the earliest possible stage. Because we know even when people are quote unquote normal on our exams, they may be declining from a previously higher level of memory. And patients will often say that, that, well, yes, my memory is normal, but I used to have very, very good memory. And so how do we detect that? Those are some of the problems I've been working on.
Thanks for sharing that. Sounds like you have a lot going on in your lab and the work that you do, important work. I do have another question here from a viewer that we have time to add in. And I don't know if you want to speak to this more generally or to your specific research studies, but this person is asking whether you disclose results to research participants in your studies. So that might mean the brain scans or results on cognitive testing or things like that.
Yeah, if participants request, we will provide a number of things. One, we can provide a short summary of the cognitive test results. It's not a clinical exam, so we don't do anything like provide a diagnosis or something that would be inappropriate. So we just provide a general idea of how they did on cognitive testing. And then we also, if they want, we can send their brain MRIs to their doctor so that the doctor can actually look at them and have that nice information. Even if they're totally normal, it's good to have the baseline, and it's valuable, medical information, given how expensive brain MRI is.
And since we're on the topic of vascular health and brain health, there's a good question here about vascular dementia versus Alzheimer's dementia. So what is the difference between these two forms of dementia, and how might they also overlap?
Yeah, this is a tough question, actually, because the field is continuing to improve its understanding of this. And there's vascular dementia is when somebody has dementia that we think is totally or predominantly caused by vascular brain injury, usually strokes or other small blood vessel damage that causes cognitive dysfunction. Whereas Alzheimer's is where you have dementia, and we think it's predominantly caused by the buildup of these sticky amyloid proteins and another protein called tau that leads to degeneration of the brain. But what we've found is that those two most common causes of dementia overlap a lot, maybe even completely to some extent. And so it's kind of a spectrum. And so we've reconceptualized this, and now we refer to cardiovascular contributions to cognitive impairment and dementia, recognizing that the blood vessel damage is seen not just by itself, but it's seen in Alzheimer's. It's actually seen in other forms of dementia as well. So we've really broadened what we think the impact of vessel damage is.
So are you saying then that vascular dementia is not then considered, its own type of diagnosis, but it's actually being more considered as a contribution to different forms of dementia?
It's still used certainly clinically as a definition because it's a traditional term, but the research field is trying to broaden the understanding, and they've also tried to change the term to vascular cognitive impairment to emphasize that we want to detect things early, not wait until someone has dementia and try and see if we can pick up on more mild vascular dysfunction. So there's been a lot of change and evolution in the field of vascular studies in dementia.
Much thanks to your work and the work of your team and colleagues. So Dr. Nation, we have a few more minutes, and I just wanted to end on, you've had a lot of training and education that have led you to this very specific research focus of vascular contributions to Alzheimer's disease. So, what motivates you in this area, and what got you ultimately really excited about doing this work?
Well, I started off actually studying vascular disease and disease models and trying to understand how behavior, stress, social stress, isolation, things like that, how those things could make vascular disease worse, there's been a lot of research in this area. And so that was where I got my start. But, as a neuropsychologist, I was seeing a lot of patients who had dementia, and I had learned that there was this cardiovascular relationship with Alzheimer's disease that no one understood. And so it piqued my interest. And then when I became a fellow, I sort of shifted fields and really learned a lot more about dementia, gained all of the tools and knowledge base that I would need to focus in this area, because I felt that it was a gap in our knowledge that seemed promising.
Well, thank you so much for all the work that you do, and thank you for the time, your time in joining me today to answer questions from me and from our viewers. We got some great questions, so thank all of you for attending live. I do have a few announcements and upcoming events that I want to let our viewers know about. So Dr. Nation, I'll let you go while I do that, but thank you again.
Thank you, Chelsea. This is great. Thanks everyone for the questions.
Thanks again, all of you, for attending today. I want to let you know about 3 upcoming virtual events that we have planned. The first is next Tuesday, November 10th. UCI Mind and the UCI School of Nursing are going to be hosting a live Q&A here on Facebook. So if you're comfortable with Facebook and using it and asking questions, this will be a great venue to watch it. It'll also be live on YouTube. And the topic is going to be caring for the caregiver. So you may or may not know that November is National Family Caregiver Month. And so in honor of that, we want to have a panel where we're focused specifically on our caregivers. And during this unprecedented time of the COVID-19 pandemic, talking about what some of the unique challenges are of dementia caregivers during this time. So if that interests you, you can register for the event at the website that you see on the screen here, mind.uci.edu/register. We hope you'll join us for that important discussion. And then I wanted to let you know about our last Facebook Live Q&A of the year will be on December 4th. with Associate Professor of Neurobiology and Behavior, Dr. Matt Blurton-Jones, and he will discuss how stem cells are being used to advance our understanding of Alzheimer's disease. So hope you'll join us for that. And then last event that I want to announce is UCI Mind's annual A December to Remember Gala, which will be virtual this year. It's free to attend the event. So we hope to have all of you attend and as many people as possible to learn about the research that's happening at UCI Mind and how people can support our mission. And that will be held on Saturday, December 5th. And here is the website for the gala if you'd like to learn more about it and register. And with that, we did talk a little bit today about participation in research studies. And so if you'd like to learn more about that, I'd just like to share again the information for our registry. And that can be found at c2c.uci.edu. So thank you again very much for your time and your attention today. And we'll look forward to seeing you at our upcoming events in 2020. Take care.